Hi, Josh.
Hey, Brink, how are you today?
I'm good. Yourself?
Not too bad. I'm having a little trouble with my equipment here, and I'm going to have to file a complaint with the equipment manager.
I don't think the viewers are going to pick up on it, but you've got static coming over your voice hands-free set, and I sometimes can't hear what you're saying. But we'll try to.
Yeah, well, it probably doesn't matter much at the time what I'm saying. So,
so I just got spent last week doing an initial round of college visits with my oldest son, and so this is the official beginning of getting sucked into the whole college admissions madness for me.
Well, you have my condolences. So he's going into his senior year?
Actually, so on the how psychotic am I scale, he's actually going into his junior year, but he wants to look at a lot of schools, and next summer promises to be very busy. So we had a kind of an open space here at the end of the summer. We figured we'd knock a few off.
What'd you think?
We went to. I'm not going to go into where we went, but we went to a bunch of top-notch East Coast schools. And it's all very. Exciting to look at these places and picture, to see him picture himself there, and me picture him having, college experiences, and it's all very daunting. A lot of these places have just abysmally low acceptance rates.
Right.
I felt relatively unpsychotic at one place. They asked for a show of hands for who all was in the middle of some extended college tour, and a lot of hands were raised, and they asked. Who thinks that they've won? Who thinks they've gone to more colleges than anybody else? And everybody looked tentative except one young woman whose hand stayed straight up, and he called on her, and she said that at the end of this trip that was concluding this week, she would have visited 19 colleges. And
she's only 11 years old, so she's getting a real jump start.
That made me feel much better about my mental health, but.
Well, that's good. It seems kind of ridiculous to me, I have to say.
It really is. It's at a certain level, if you're trying to get into an elite competitive college, and if you're at a strong secondary school where lots of people are aiming at the same level, then you have just an unavoidable competitiveness amongst the students that they've been working really hard, and this is a way for them to show that it's all paid off. So they have high expectations, both internally and peer driven. And the parent body is they're all a bunch of crazies who are incredibly competitive about everything, including how well their kids do, and so it's sheer madness.
I guess the piece of this that I find hardest to understand is what information people think that they're going to get by visiting all these schools that really is going to enable them to distinguish between the schools in a way that's relevant to anything at all.
No, I think that's right.
You might... Sorry, my static is giving me trouble here. There are lots and lots of fantastically good schools out there, and I think if you decide what part of the country you want to be in and whether you want to be in a big place or a little place, and within certain general at what level you want to be at. Beyond that, I can't really see that the differences that people are attentive to make any difference at all to anything that matters. Ultimately, what matters being the quality of somebody's life.
Yeah, I agree. On the other hand, it's a really important choice, not necessarily statistically. That is, given a certain level of ability, where you go to school doesn't really matter that much. If you're talented and willing to work hard, you're probably going to do well, and you'll do well at whatever school you go to. But still, as to the specifics of your life, it matters a lot. It's you're going to make lifelong friends. You may meet the person you marry. There's all kinds of things that are going to be very different about your life depending on where you go. And so to make that choice without ever having visited the place seems fairly whimsical. But I completely agree.
I don't know. You really think so? I think it is a very consequential choice. I agree about that, but it's consequential in so many ways that defy prediction. That the kind of information. So you think, well, I might marry somebody who I'm going to school with.
Of course,
but you think you might figure
right.
that out if you go there?
No, of course not.
What information are you going to get?
I know that when I was a kid, it was a lot simpler for me. I was I wasn't in the kind of competitive situation my kids are in. I was in a public school in a relatively small southern town where it was quite usual just to go to work right after high school, and quite unusual to go to a top school. And I went to a few and visited them, and I hit the Princeton campus, and it was just lovely, and I fell in love with the way it looked. And that's no good reason for doing anything, but people make marriage decisions on that kind of basis all the time. There's some sort of initial irrational attraction, and you don't know what it is. But if it speaks to something in you, then I don't see any harm. And I don't see why it would be more meritorious to make a college decision without ever having visited anywhere than to visit them. I think going to 19 schools in a row is insane. But it's inherently going to be an arbitrary decision. But that doesn't mean you should just make it completely blind.
I won't take. I agree with you. It's not meritorious to make the decision without ever having been. And I won't take any credit for the fact that I did. But I did. I was an undergraduate at Yale, and I did go there after I was admitted, and that is for a visit before I attended, and I liked the place, but I had no idea anything about it other than that it was had a reputation for being a pretty good school and a very good school, and I was glad to have gone there, although I suppose if I had gone a whole bunch of other places, I would have been glad to have gone those places. I think there is some sense that you can get, I agree with what you said. You go as what you said about Princeton. It's one of these blink decisions. You go there, you look at it, and you say, this is for me.
Right.
The kind of close inspection of courses and faculty and programs, and that I think is all kind of irrational.
Yeah.
It doesn't give you any information that really is going to make any difference to you. But I do think it's part of this general hyper-parenting excess that is, I think, a particularly unattractive part of the culture.
Yeah, I want to talk about that, but let me first just put you on the spot as someone who makes your living working in elite universities. So I'm now the consumer. What am I getting? We know that the so-called college premium, that is the difference between the wages of a college grad and the wages of a high school grad, that college premium has gone up considerably in the past quarter century or so. Yes. It was around 30 or 40% as of 1980. It's around 60 or 70% today. Back and then an even bigger grad school premium today. It was about 50 or 60%, I think, in 1980, and now it's 110%, something like that today. So we know that there's a big economic payoff to having these degrees, but the question is, where does the payoff come from? Are you actually learning economically relevant skills at college that then pay off in the marketplace? Are you truly accumulating human capital, or or have we just entered some sort of credentialist society where we have these arbitrary gates we have to go through, and one of them is going to school? Or is it a signal of some combination of intellectual ability and conscientiousness that somehow or another employers can't pick up those signals any other way other than forcing everybody to spend an arm and a leg going to college to send the signal? I don't know, and I don't think the people who have studied this have come up with very definitive answers either.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I can just one prefatory point, which is, I've taught it, as you know, at two places, MIT and now Stanford. And one thing, I not really quite on the point of what you're asking about, but I do want to say that it's an incredible privilege to teach at these places. I mean, I suppose it's a privilege to go to these places,
yes,
too. But it's an incredible privilege to teach a bunch of kids who are really sharp and really dedicated and working very hard. And I mean, I actually don't have that clear a sense yet of how hard students at Stanford work, but I did have a very clear sense that students at MIT worked really, really hard.
Yeah.
And it's fantastic to be able to teach a bunch of young kids who were like that. it's, as I say, a great privilege in life.
Put aside the economic payoff, if there weren't any kind of special or increased economic payoff, I'm a firm believer in the value of education and just enriching you as an individual, and to do it in that environment where you've got a lot of smart, turned-on people who are excited about ideas and excited about learning and around top-notch minds, teaching them. That's just a fantastic way to spend 4 years.
Yeah, it's a good thing, and people should. I wish more parents, and I suppose more students as well, principally thought of it that way. I'm sorry, I really am getting a lot of distracting static here.
But I do worry that there is some kind of fairly big market failure going on right now, and as a libertarian, I tend to be skeptical about big market failures, but it seems like a lot of people are going to college that aren't necessarily burning to be there, except for the kind of party scene. Right. And yet they're there because they feel they have to be. I'm not sure that they're learning stuff that is directly relevant to why they have to be there, which is to get a good job. And yet, if that is the case, if in fact college is kind of a waste of time for a lot of people, then why is there this huge economic premium associated with it? It suggests that there's a much cheaper and more efficient way to go about things, to pick people who have the right job skills with a combination of ability and drive, and that somehow or another employers have failed to figure out how to come up with a better screen than college diplomas. Now, there is a theory that the Supreme Court ruled out intelligence testing for employers in a 1971, I believe, case, Griggs versus Duke Power. And so that perhaps the kind of legal hostility to employee testing has led employers to basically do testing by surreptitious means, that the people who are coming out of the top schools are likely the people with the top SAT scores, which means the people that would do well on these kinds of tests that they can't administer. So I don't. That can't be the whole story, but it may be a part of it.
That can't be the whole story for a reason that you just gave, which is, it could be like recruiting basketball players. They show that the kids show that they do real well by doing well on the SAT scores, and you tell them to skip college and just come and work for you. Yeah. Somebody told me, and maybe this is, I'm sorry, I'm making some adjustments here. Somebody told me that Google had more than 1 million job applicants last year, and that they do use IQ tests as a screening device.
I know that Microsoft is known for very rigorous testing as well, and I don't know how those places, what they do squares with legal restrictions that other employers seem to be under. And it also
I think on the earnings issue, there are a couple of different points. First thing is that part of the earnings disparity is because of the increase in returns to college, and part of it is that people who don't have high school degrees, but also people who just have high school degrees have lost some of their earnings. So the spread is a consequence of forces working in two different directions. One pushing college premium up, returns to college up, and the other pushing costs to not having gone to college at all, and in particular to not having finished high school down. I also suspect an answer to the question, is there anything relevant, economically relevant that you learn? Two things to say. First of all, as you were saying a minute ago, there's lots of stuff that you learn in old-fashioned stuff that you learn by going to college that may not have any economic relevance at all, and that's an important part of the reason for going to college. You maybe you read a few good books.
Right.
You learn to develop a passion, not under the close inspection of your parents.
Yep.
Maybe you learn to care a little bit about what's worth caring about. I mean, I teach a course called, I named it after Michael Sandel's Harvard course, which draws about 1,000 students a year. It's called Justice. I've been teaching it for about 20 years. And I've designed it as the kind of course that you ought to go to college in order to take. We read things that ranging from, Hayek to Rawls on the ideological wider on the ideological spectrum than that, but it's sort of basic work in political philosophy about liberty and equality, and that's one of the things that you should go to college to. That's a first point. It doesn't answer the question about returns to college. I suspect, having taught at MIT, that the answer to the question of whether or not you learn anything that's economically relevant to performance in the market probably varies some depending on what you study and where you go to school. I mean, my sense is, I think about 2/3 of the students who go to MIT get engineering degrees, either electrical, chemical, or whatever, and they are learning stuff that bears on their future employment. If you're studying English literature, you're probably not learning stuff that bears on your future employment, although you may be developing a set of skills about reading and reflection and writing that aren't bad skills to have. So I'm not sure that there's. I haven't studied this question, and I don't plan to. But I suspect that the answer may vary a little bit.
I'm sure that's the case. I'm thinking mostly about sort of liberal arts majors at not top schools. That they're absolutely, their economic fortunes are much brighter if they get that degree, and I'm not quite sure why. I know from my own experience going to law school, and there you would expect a more direct connection between the curriculum and practical work needs, since it's sort of a trade school. But I would say, about 90% of what I learned at law school was of no application whatsoever to me as a practicing lawyer, and about 90% of what I learned as a practicing lawyer I didn't learn in law school. So, and yet at least some part of that experience was vital in preparing me for legal practice. But I'm not sure that 3 years of incredibly expensive education were the most efficient way to pick up those skills. So anyway,
right. But the part that was relevant to your subsequent practice was
the first year curriculum, generally
thinking
learning how to read cases,
thinking like a lawyer.
Yeah, thinking like a lawyer, that kind of stuff.
Thinking like a lawyer, that's what you get the first year. I mean, I have an appointment here in the law school, 25%, and I've never had an appointment in a law school before, so I'm just picking up the jargon here. So but one model is the first year you learn to think like a lawyer, and then you spend 2 more years doing it just so you don't forget what you learned the first year.
That's
kind
about
of hammered into you.
So, just basic legal analysis and legal reasoning and learning how to read cases and find the holdings and things like that, and sorting through how complex bodies of doctrine fit together and rules and exceptions fit together and all of that kind of stuff. But I came away with the experience thinking that law school should be 1 year, but that's just me.
Right.
So anyway, we were talking about this, that whatever college is worth, certainly parents these days think it's a matter of life and death, and particularly in the kind of upper parts of the socioeconomic spectrum, the kind of upper middle class syndrome of hyper-competitive parents and hyper-organized children with incredible resumes and doing all of these kinds of extracurriculars in addition to 57 AP classes. What does it all mean? And in the middle of it, I know that there's a whole bunch of stuff that's excessive and crazy and off-putting.
Right.
And yet, I have to say that it seems that there's a method to the madness, I think. I read a very interesting book a while back called Unequal Childhoods by a sociologist, Annette Leroux.
Yeah.
And she did these in-depth studies of fourth graders looking at folks who were, low-income people, working-class people, and middle and upper-middle-class income people. And she didn't see, and living with the families, just on-site all the time, and her idea was to see distinctions in parenting style that may break out along socioeconomic lines. And she saw the clear dividing line was between working and lower class on the one hand and middle and upper middle class on the other. And the distinction she drew, the name she gave to it was that the working class parenting style was the one that I think was much more general a generation or two ago, which she calls accomplishment of natural growth, which is basically your job as a parent is to keep your kids fed and out of trouble, and then they kind of grow naturally on themselves, by themselves. And you don't spend a lot of time being involved in their schoolwork. You don't spend a lot of time structuring organized extracurricular activities. These kids have a lot more free time, a lot more unsupervised time. They're a lot less uptight. They're a lot friendlier, according to her, to strangers. They get along better with their siblings. They're less whiny. And yet, when it comes time to enter the workforce, they don't have that kind of hyper drive to achieve socioeconomic success. They're not comfortable dealing with impersonal bureaucratic institutions and finding their way in them and making their way in them. They're not comfortable dealing with strangers and making kind of instrumental relationships with people that they didn't grow up with. On the other hand, the other style of parenting she calls concerted cultivation, and that's the kind that I'm certainly in the middle of, and that's this very concerted effort to mold children into socioeconomic successes, just obsessing over making sure that they're properly stimulated, making sure that they're not wasting time when they could be doing some enrichment activity. I feel like in our family we've been on the kind of low end of that craziness, but I'm still in that milieu, and I'm quite familiar with it. And it has unpleasant aspects. It's very stressful in the home, and you've got kids that don't really know what to do with free time because they don't have much, and they're more competitive and maybe a little less
what
laid back.
Explains it?
And yet
What
they're the people
explains
who are primed to succeed in our current social structure. So,
well, let's sit on this for a minute. Primed to succeed in the current social structure. There are two things. The first thing that I think is very, Annette Leroux is a wonderful person and a wonderful sociologist, and the finding about differences in parenting, the finding about differences in the styles of parenting, I entirely believe. The differences in the effects of the styles of parenting, I'm not so sure about. So, in order to know whether or not the hyper-parenting style, the cultivation style, really is important to achieving anything that's worth achieving at all, or achieving things that aren't worth achieving, there's a kind of long-term follow-up that you would need to do that is extremely hard to do in sociology, psychology, or social psychology. The fact is that there's virtually nothing that's known about early childhood indicators of success that predicts long-term success, partly because it's there isn't a high payoff to doing those kinds of studies. There's the one thing I'm told by a friend who's the expert in this stuff, the one thing that's well known, that's known and that's of importance and interest, is that, when you're 2 years old and they do these studies where they see if you're able to restrain yourself from taking the second cookie,
yes.
If you can't restrain yourself from taking the second cookie, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
Here are two things that are not known. First, it's not known whether restraining yourself from taking the third cookie makes things even worse. So
right.
We don't know what the shape of the function looks like. And here's another thing, even more important, that people just don't know the answer to it, which is they know that you can teach young kids, to do better at self-restraint,
yeah.
at executive function. What's not known is if kids who are taught improved executive function also have better life prospects than kids who don't have very good executive function. So it's not clear. People don't know whether whether being taught to be self-disciplined, so to speak, is just as good as being, so to speak, naturally self-disciplined. It would be nice to know the answer to that question, but people don't know it. So if you tell me that how you're parented when you're 8 years old makes a big difference to your lifetime success, I don't believe it. That is, it's not, when I say I don't believe it, what I mean is I don't think it's really known one way or another whether or not that's true. The problem is that in order to figure out whether it's the style of parenting that's making a difference, you'd have to, the relevant groups to look at would not be the lower middle class kids who are getting one style and the upper middle class kids who are getting the different style. You want to study the variation within the upper middle class kids or within the lower middle class kids.
Yeah.
Find the laid back upper middle class parents, and I'm not sure if it's not an experiment that you can get past the.
Yeah. No, I think there's a whole host of qualifications that need to be made about any of this. LaRoe's work is interesting and suggestive, but she certainly doesn't connect the dots between what she observes and ultimate life experiences. Also, anything you're going to say as a generalization is going to be, there's going to be tons of exceptions at the individual level.
So here's what I think about this. I think that people's beliefs about the connection, I'll throw this out. I'm not sure if I really believe this, but just to be provocative.
Okay.
I think parents believe that these kinds of hyper organized activities really do make a difference. They love their kids and they want their kids to do well, and they think that those activities really do make a difference. But their belief that they make a difference is a reflection of two familiar factors. One is a kind of social anxiety. There's a sort of norm of what it is to be a responsible parent,
yep.
And you're anxious if you're not performing according to that standard, even if you have no idea whether performing according to that standard has any good consequences. And the second thing is that I think that parents, particularly upper middle class parents, we tend to be kind of control freaks.
Yeah.
And at least to some extent, some of this hyper organized activity is compensation, maybe overcompensation, excessive compensation for kids spending a lot of time on IM, MySpace, Facebook. Parents want to regulate the kids' activities. They're somehow persuaded that those things aren't very constructive or productive. And, I don't know if they are or not. I do have to, just a footnote here, Brink, I noticed that you are not on Facebook, and I was very disappointed to see that. I am going to send you an invitation.
Yeah, I haven't figured that out yet. I'm still a Facebook, newbie.
Yeah.
But, yeah, First, again, there's a lot of excess in this upper middle class hyperparenting syndrome, and no doubt about that. I would say to hang on to some important differences between working class and middle class parenting that do seem to make a difference. First, and now I'm forgetting the name of the researchers that have nailed this down, but there's a startling difference in the verbal stimulation that working class kids and upper middle class kids get in the early years of life. You look at the words per hour or words per year, and it's an extremely verbal environment in the upper middle class home, and that is thought by some, including James Heckman, who studied this feedback mechanism in the early childhood years between nurture and nature. That is thought to show up later in IQ scores, and so there's an environment where you're just being stimulated to be open to the environment and be open to the environment and interpreting the environment with these abstract linguistic kind of tools. And then further, there is, I think, a pretty strong correlation between IQ levels and impulse control and time preference. Again, I think having to do with this kind of abstract way of looking at the world, rather than the here and now and the concrete. You're thinking in terms of ideas and an abstract future that may be less visible to someone who's more stuck in the here and now. So that, and I think there is a pretty clear connection, definitely not decisive, but a real connection between intellectual ability as measured by IQ tests and subsequent socioeconomic success. And those IQ numbers get locked in fairly early, and then it's kind of hard to do much about them. So what happens in the early childhood years may very much have a role in how much of your natural intellectual potential gets realized in the childhood development process, and then also how various non-cognitive skills that are correlated with those cognitive skills, like time preference, impulse control, how those get developed as well. Those seem to be more capable of being developed later in life as well, but it's harder, from the literature that I've read. Secondly, and I think this may be something farther down the line, but maybe not, that the idea of the horizons that you have in terms of kind of thinking of life as your neighborhood and your family and your relatives versus thinking of this kind of abstract world where you can picture yourself going to any college across the country and living in any city and doing a umpteen different kinds of jobs, this sort of abstract version of self-identity that middle-class kids are habituated with all of this organization and dealing with organized institutions. That clearly must be, those skills are very useful because they just open your imagination to being able to picture yourself doing things that otherwise you wouldn't even cross your mind as possibilities. I know just from personal experience, it was very weird for people in my high school to go to top schools, and about 40% of my graduating class just went to work, and the vast majority went to either community college or to the local state universities. And it was only when I kind of fell into a crowd of older kids, there were a couple of years ahead of me, several of whom were brainy and were going off to elite schools, that it even popped into my head that such a thing was possible. So when you're in an environment where everyone's striving and everyone's in the go-ahead thing and they're doing all kinds of interesting enrichment activities, and then I think you just may have a wider idea of what is possible for your life than if you're raised in more constricted circumstances. And I think you can go overboard on that, no doubt about it, and I think a lot of this hyper-scheduling is compensation for parents who are spending a lot of time on the job and not much time with their kids, but still there's some core of it that I think seems to be functional in the way we live now.
I have 3 points. First of all, I know you share, I know you have some of the kind of Hayekian humility. There isn't that much that we know.
Yeah,
and I think particularly in this area, I'm just impressed with really how little we know. This was the report that I mentioned about the study that was done on executive control at age 2. This was reported to me by somebody who is a cognitive neuroscientist, who said that this is really the only test measure at age 2, maybe age 2 or 3, that predicts anything in subsequent about your subsequent life, and that it's really hard to, if you have executive control problems, it's really tough to come back from that, and that there isn't anything else that does. So I'm impressed with how little, I am very impressed with how little we know. The second thing is that, you mentioned the, language exposure, when you're young, just sheer number of words. Maybe that's true. It seems entirely believable that that's a good thing in a variety of ways. But that's something that you get without specific instruction or without being taken around to a bunch of stuff,
right.
Without hyper-parenting. So that's one of these things, one of the reasons that I was saying that I'd be a little bit skeptical about studies about parenting style in the early years making a difference to later stuff, as opposed to other kind of social environmental factors make a difference. I could perfectly well believe, but that it's specifically parenting style feels to me a little bit like a rationalization for a parenting style that my sense about it, though I don't know, my sense about it is driven by other considerations.
Yeah, we'll move on to other topics. I'll just close with one observation, just from a personal level, because I agree that the academic studies are they're interesting and subjective, but suggestive, but it's really close to impossible to pin stuff down with any definition, particularly looking at early childhood development, because you just can't elicit the responses from the kids in those first early years of life that you're looking for, because their verbal skills aren't good enough yet. But I know, contrasting my upbringing, where school was easy and I didn't have to spend much time working on it, and I just had tons of free time and a much more laissez-faire kind of parenting environment when I was growing up than is the norm today.
Yeah.
I know that I didn't have organization skills or much of a work ethic until my mid to late 20s, when I was a lawyer and working for a living. School was always pretty easy, and I'd never been habituated to have to be well organized and handle a large volume of stuff. And I look at my kids, and just the volume of schoolwork that they do is much more challenging than the schoolwork I did, and the way non-school life for kids now is much more structured than just hanging out with neighborhood kids, and so they have to handle scheduling and stuff. And I'm quite sure that organizationally and just work ethic wise, they're light years ahead of where I was, and I know I missed opportunities just from not having my stuff together, that they're not going to miss those tricks, and so I think there's some functionality there. But again, going overboard is a risk.
It may be. I mean, they probably will be less prone to waste their time on blogging heads conversations.
So sticking with our school theme for a couple of months now, you wanted to talk about these recent school integration cases that came out at the end of the Supreme Court term last year, and we didn't have time for it. But you're still ticked off about those cases. So why don't you vent, and I'll
I'd like
tell you
to
what
vent a little bit about it. Although this, I'm sorry to keep on coming back to this theme, but the static on the line is just is very distracting. But let me see if I can. I do have. Adult onset auditory attention deficit disorder, so the auditory distractions are making it tough for me. So bear with me. Towards the end of the term, the Supreme Court decided these school integration cases that came out of Seattle and Louisville, and it was there was some real heat that was generated between the Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Breyer when the decisions were announced, and you won't be surprised to hear that I'm in this very much on Breyer's side. Yep. The basic deal here is I think there are three things. First, I think it's important to keep in mind, but what you had in both Seattle and in Louisville were very long-standing efforts to deal with the phenomenon, some of us might say the problem of racially divided schools.
Yep.
This was not a consistent, there were not consistent policy instruments used over the period of really post-Brown, I mean almost since 56 in the case of Louisville, but, say over a period of about 40 years, not consistent policy instruments used, but consistent efforts to get more racially mixed schools. And the shifts in policy included periods of using school busing, then dropping school busing, periods of more rigid school assignment, and then periods of greater choice, partly motivated in both cases by concerns about white flight.
Yep.
So what you have were a series of efforts over a long period of time on the part of these two school districts in Seattle and Louisville to deal with what they perceived as being a serious problem. I should just a detail here. In the case of Louisville, up until about 6 or 7 years ago, this was done under court order.
Yeah.
In the case of Seattle, there never was a court order.
Right.
In the case of Louisville, the court order was lifted about 6 or 7 years ago. But in the case of Seattle, the school desegregation plans were developed in a litigation context. That is, they were being sued by the NAACP, and rather than go through the courts, they adopted the series of plans to try to deal with the issue. So that's a first point. There is a history here of efforts, and of efforts of different kinds, not a kind of rigidity, but adaptive efforts. Secondly, what I would describe it, and arguably tendentiously, as a series of intelligent and conscientious efforts by the school boards to keep some kind of racial balance in the schools for a variety of purposes, including purposes of remedying past exclusion and injustice, a purpose of sort of educational purposes of, judging that the purposes of student learning would be better served by more racially diverse schools, and also the larger purpose, a kind of Deweyan purpose of thinking of schools as educating students for democracy and giving them a kind of early experience of diversity for the purposes of achieving a more civically diverse and inclusive society. And more, I'd say generically speaking, the goal in each of these cases was a goal of greater social and political inclusion. The court, this is the third point, the court majority said that these school integration programs were legally unacceptable. And I think there are two large flaws in the court's perspective on this. The first is that I think, sorry, I'm really having trouble here with the static. There, maybe that'll do. The first is, it seems to me that there was a kind of disrespect of democracy in the court's decision. These were, and as I said, you could say this is tendentious in my description of it, but these were serious efforts by locally elected officials to try to deal to the best of their ability with what they judged to be a problem, which was, racially uniform schools. Yeah. There were no doubt other ways of trying to deal with the problem, but these were not kind of imposed bureaucratically. They were not imposed once and never adjusted again. There were a series of efforts conscientiously and intelligently undertaken by elected officials to deal with this serious problem of educational, social, civic inclusion. And I think for the court to override that judgment, substitute its own judgment for the judgment of these officials, and to say, well, they could have done things differently, et cetera, I think is not doesn't show an appropriate respect for democracy. I also think, and maybe this is an even more important point, I don't think the majority really takes seriously the importance of dealing with racial division and racial exclusion. There's the line, now oft-cited line at the end of Justice Roberts' opinion for the court, in which he says, basically the best way to eliminate racial discrimination is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. And I think that's it's ridiculous for the court to insist that it knows that if you want to achieve a society where there's racial inclusion, the best way to do that is not to use any kind of racial categories in the course of achieving that goal of a society in which there isn't discrimination or subordination, exclusion on the basis of race. That's a question on which people's judgments differ, and it goes back to the earlier point. It's a judgment on which I think the court should let people who've thought about this problem for a long time, who've been working on it, who are in conversation with parents, whose responsibility is for schools, they should defer to those judgments and not pretend that you can solve a serious and long-standing social problem through the invocation of a tautology.
Yeah, let me just say a couple of things. I have not read the decisions except just in the sort of barest excerpt form, so I can't really comment on the details of Roberts' opinion versus Breyer's opinion and
Yeah.
Kennedy's opinion as well. And that's important to note. The Roberts opinion that's oft cited is a plurality opinion. They got their fifth vote from Kennedy, who wrote a separate opinion. And he took a rather softer line. He did not show a complete across-the-board kind of broad, sweeping hostility towards race-conscious remedies that Roberts did, but he found that in these particular cases, the way things were done was objectionable. And in particular, as I understand it, in these cases, for particular individuals, race was frequently a decisive factor in where they would go to school. So it was this very tight nexus, rather than sort of drawing districts with a general idea of what your racial composition was going to be, specific individual assignments on the basis of race, went over whatever Anthony Kennedy's little trigger is. You never know what's going to, he doesn't have much of a predictable style of jurisprudence, but here it went too far for him. Secondly, I think in the Seattle case, he thought the racial categories were out of whack with the goals. The goals were racial diversity and so forth, and yet the categories were white and non-white. And this is in a city where there's a substantial Asian population, substantial Hispanic population, and even a not insignificant Native American population. And so, rather than a system that was designed to truly promote racial or ethnic diversity, it seemed to be a system just to make sure that there was a critical mass of white kids in different schools, and that didn't sound like what he thought was the school system's goal. So there were narrow objections that he made that in these particular cases there were objectionable aspects of the system. But you're right that Roberts took a much more sweeping line. I would just, for my own part, have to say that I know you're worked up about this. I just can't get very worked up about it. First, because in my ideal world, we wouldn't have a system where 90% of kids went to government-run schools. We'd have a system where a lot of the schools were privately run, and people went to schools based on which ones they chose to go to, and with government assistance if they couldn't handle the tuition. Secondly, even if we stay within a public school framework, I would much rather have a system of open public school choice, where families get to choose where they have relatively open enrollment, and kids get to choose where they go to school. There's a number of public school systems that have these kinds of systems. They do and even better, the funding for the schools follows the kids, so that schools are actually in competition for each other to get student bodies, and so the kind of educational system I would like to see, whether it's a full-blown private school choice system or a public school choice system, is one where the decisions about where to go to school are driven by family decisions at the family level, not by top-down social engineers who have, idealistic Deweyan visions of using education to mold people in the way they see fit. And then finally, whatever the heroic efforts of top-down social engineers over the decades to structure educational access in the ways they think are salutary, the fact is this bottom-up desire to live and educate your kids like you want just keeps winning out. And so this debate seems kind of academic in a world where inner-city school systems are overwhelmingly minority kids, and these kinds of schemes are defeated again and again by people moving to where they can get good schools for their kids. So you just can't force people into following these kinds of idealistic visions that you have, and they keep getting defeated, and they don't work very well. And I don't think that they are consistent with a liberal idea of individual autonomy in parenting and education. So.
Well, there are a couple of things. I mean, the first point that you make is absolutely right. Kennedy's opinion in the case is different from the plurality opinion, and it is more open to the use of racial categorizations in achieving the goal of racial equality.
Right.
That there were objections, I thought ill-taken objections. Nevertheless, there were objections that he had that went to the specifics of these programs. On the larger points that you make, first of all, these programs in the districts that were overturned were very substantially involved choice, so the value of choice was significantly respected. That was true. I used to live in Cambridge. Cambridge was one of the first programs, public school programs that involved a lot of choice. But there were also efforts for a while on the basis of race, and eventually they dropped race, and they were using income, class, as a way of getting kind of balance in schools. But these seem to me autonomy has an uncertain role here, because we're talking about kids, and it's a contestable proposition that parents, this really goes back to our earlier conversation, contestable proposition that parents should have quite as much control over the location of their kids' education as you're supposing. We're not, talk about autonomy effaces the distinction between kids and parents. It's the kids that we're talking about here, and they're not particularly good at guiding their own education.
No,
I do believe,
right.
I don't believe in paternalism for adults.
Not the kids' autonomy.
Yeah. Right, but then it's the case for the controlling value of autonomy when it comes to decisions about your kids' education, as opposed to when it comes to decisions about your conduct. I think there are some steps that have to be filled in there. The case isn't so secure, but the issue here is what you say about the difficulties and complexities of, so to speak, getting it right in the design of school systems, whether it's about the boundaries, where the schools are going to be located, who's going to be in the schools, whether the schools are big or small, what exactly the social and ethnic composition of the schools is going to be, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all incredibly complicated questions, and there's a matter of democracy here as well as a matter of individual autonomy of parents. One of the things that I found offensive about the court's decision is that there was no sense that people who were on the ground working on these questions, thinking about them, trying to find solutions to school issues that accommodate a variety of different values, including civic values as well as values of individual education, high achievement, etc., that the judgments of those people should be deferred to at all. You can always invent ideal schemes of education for kids, but as you know, those things don't work on the ground, and I'd be just more prepared, maybe more prepared than you are, certainly more prepared than the court is, to think that the judgments of officials who are familiar with the problem, who've tried things out, who are maybe learning something from experience, and who are trying to act, I think, in a conscientious, serious, and informed and dedicated way to addressing these issues should get some kind of deference. But I also think, and this is something where I know I agree with the court majority, and maybe or I disagree with the court majority, and maybe I disagree with Kennedy. I'm not sure. Maybe I disagree with you. Is I do think there is all the difference in the world between a design of a school system that keeps out a bunch of kids who were excluded from all other aspects of society. And that's what Brown v. Board of Education was about. Yep. All the difference in the world between that and the use of racial categorizations in a setting where you're trying to be more inclusive, where you're trying to get a society where there's greater ethnic and racial diversity and genuine equality of opportunity. And the thing that was most offensive about the court's opinion, the plurality opinion in particular, was the idea that these school programs in Seattle and in Louisville smacked of the kind of system of caste racial subordination that was in place before Brown v. Board of Education. I think the inability to draw that kind of distinction is really, it's a terrible failure to take seriously the problem of race in the United States.
I agree with you. There's just, a universe of difference between the motivations and moral character of what these school systems were trying to do and what the segregated schools in the Jim Crow era were like. So I don't want to. I think it's facile to equate the two at all. But nonetheless, there is some common link between these two things. One, under the Brown system, under segregated schooling, you wanted to go to a school and you lived in that area, but you couldn't go. The state said you couldn't go because you're the wrong color. And here, particular people had chosen to go to a school and they were denied specifically on the basis of race. So again, the state is saying you can't do something because of your race to an individual person. And that, I think, that individualization of the social engineering here and the starkness of the racial component as the criterion for a decision, those strike me as worrisome. But again, I don't think that I wouldn't want to compare what these folks were trying to do with Jim Crow. I think that's just silly.
Yeah. I just let me say, just because I think it's pretty clear that we disagree on this some, but I don't want. This is a very important issue, and I think it's very important not to. It's important to get the disagreements clear, but also important not to exaggerate them. I think it's entirely appropriate to say that there's something worrisome about the use of the racial categorizations in this place, even while saying at the same time that it's facile to equate the Seattle program with Topeka, Kansas, pre-Brown v. Board of Education. And I think that's a reason that you want to look carefully at, give some kind of heightened scrutiny, as the lawyers say,
right.
Some kind of heightened scrutiny to these systems of school assignment where you are using racial categories. It doesn't smell quite right, but I think that these things, really withstand whatever level of scrutiny is appropriate to give. What I powerfully reject, and I gather you do too, is the position that was taken by the plurality, which is that there is no morally, from the point of view of political morality, there is no relevant distinction between Seattle 2007 using racial categorizations in an inclusive way and Topeka, Kansas 1954 using race to maintain a system of racial caste subordination. I think that's
So since I haven't read Robert's opinion, I can't comment on whether that is a fair characterization of his analysis. But I would say, that you're right. That there's just a qualitative difference morally, I think, between race-conscious inclusiveness and race-conscious exclusion. If I were designing my own private school or setting up a school, I would absolutely want it to have all kinds of diversity in the student body, including racial diversity. I think it would not serve the students there to have it be homogeneous, including racially homogeneous. On the other hand, I do draw a very firm line, even when the utilitarian or consequentialist considerations go the other way. I don't see how you can. I think it's a very bedrock principle of a liberal society that the state has to be fairly limited in what it does in intruding in family child raising decisions, and educational decisions are amongst the most important decisions that parents make. And so I think this kind of scheme that we have where kids education is taken out of their parents' hand and is put in the hands of people who are thinking about broad social visions rather than about the specific welfare of those kids is not the right way to go, and strikes me as deeply wrongheaded. And also it's so contrary to the interests or the perceived interests of parents that it's inevitably defeated by unintended consequences. So that whatever you think, even if you think it would be great to have a system where these wise and judicious officials direct the education of children and make their educational choices for the parents, the fact is parents aren't going to agree, and they're going to figure out a way to run around the system, which is what we have had. So despite 50 years of post-Brown court-ordered and school board supervised attempts to achieve racial balance, we're just not there, and because people don't want to be treated like sheep, and they're not going to do what you tell them.
It's a generous interpretation of the reasons that it hasn't worked to say that people don't want to be treated like sheep. I suspect that there are a variety of motives that are involved, and some of them are maybe less noble than the desire.
Absolutely, but
not to be treated as sheep.
Some people have chosen educational quality for their children over making their children be foot soldiers in the battle for social justice, and some have made less creditable decisions, to be sure, but.
I agree with you. It's a mix of things, but I think it's one of the. As I know you do from your book, you think it's one of the great, and I think it's one of the great achievements of the society over the course of our lifetime, that the most extreme, objectionable, and certainly legally enforced forms of racial exclusion have been eliminated. If I had to make my list of the areas where in which the society has made moral progress since I was born in 1951, that's way at the top of my list.
Yep.
And I think that process of achieving a society that delivers on the promise of being a society of equals is, and I think you agree on this as well, is way far from being completed, however we interpret the idea of a society of equals. But I think that the real test of our ability to do that is to make some progress on in being a racially more just society. And the idea that the court has thrown down a significant hurdle in the way of doing that, while at the same time showing incredible disrespect for democracy. These are not self-appointed bureaucrats. They're not operating at the national level. These are locally elected officials who take seriously that the country has a problem of racial inequality, and they're trying to do something about it that at the same time respects the importance of giving kids a quality education and also respects the importance of parental choice. And it's tough to accommodate all those things. And nobody sitting, off on the Supreme Court has ever given this issue enough attention to claim to any kind of expertise about it, and certainly not some uniformity of expertise that extends across the country. So I think it does really disrespect the significance of the problem about racial inequality, and also disrespects the value of democracy. But anyway, now I think we're...
Yeah, I'll just say that I agree with you, of course, that the end of state-sponsored, state-backed racial exclusion is a huge breakthrough for our society and a huge step forward. And yet, many much more difficult to address problems remain.
Absolutely.
That there's a wide dispersion, or just wide differences between some people's abilities to thrive in this society and others, and in particular we see problems disproportionately concentrated amongst certain ethnic groups, even in a legal environment of formal equality and formal liberty, and I'm afraid that decades of experimentation with fiddling around with school districts haven't made any discernible progress in addressing those deeper and more subtle issues. And so I just, as I said, don't feel passionately about these particular line of decisions, because I don't think that the bottom line stakes are very high. Whatever school system they come up with, the underlying socioeconomic problems that are concentrated in particular ethnic groups are still going to be there, and I think this is sort of a distraction from thinking about how policy might be changed and how people might live their lives differently so that the full promise of the kind of freedom we now enjoy is more widely enjoyed.
I agree that the focus on the use of racial categorizations in school assignment to address a more pervasive set of problems and issues of the kind that we talked about a few weeks ago when we discussed, for example, the Obama and Edwards proposals on dealing with concentrated central city and race-specific policy, or the problems that I talked about with Glenn Lowry a couple of weeks ago on Blogging Heads about race and imprisonment. This is, in a way, the racial categorizations and school assignments issue is really small potatoes in dealing with that problem. The thing that's awful about the court decision, from my point of view, is that they don't take the problem seriously. I don't think they take the problem seriously. They're disrespectful of democracy, and that they take this position that there is no distinction relevant that sounds in political morality between Topeka, Kansas, 1954, and Seattle, 2007. And I think if you're going to make headway on the larger issues, and we both agree about what those larger issues are, you make headway on those larger issues, that is a very, very unpromising place to start. But speaking of starting, maybe this is a good time to finish.
Yes, it's time to finish. I'll give you the last word. Nice talking with you. Look forward to chatting again.
All right. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.